The foundation of success was not built on stone for Elias, but on the ironclad weight of a man's word. He had started with a single truck and a map, expanding a modest delivery route into a global logistics empire. To the public, he was a titan of commerce, but to his employees, he was a mentor who believed loyalty was the only currency that mattered. He lived by a simple code. If you take care of your people, the business will take care of itself. For 30 years, this integrity was his strength, until the day he met Julian. Julian arrived during a sharp supply chain crisis that threatened Elias's overseas operations. A brilliant strategist with an effortless charm, Julian solved in days what an entire board of directors couldn't fix in months. Their professional respect quickly evolved into a deep personal bond. Julian spoke of legacy and brotherhood, mirrors of Elias's own values. They spent countless evenings over expensive scotch, plotting the future. Elias, who lacked a successor, began to see Julian as the son he'd always wanted, a man capable of carrying his vision into the next century. The pinnacle of their partnership was Project Titan, an ambitious plan to consolidate all assets into a single powerful entity. Julian argued that to move fast enough to crush competitors, Elias needed to sign over temporary executive control. It was a necessary maneuver, he claimed, to bypass the slow gears of corporate law. Blinded by gratitude and friendship, Elias viewed the request not as a risk, but as a final gesture of mutual trust. However, cracks began to appear when Elias's long-term CFO voiced serious concerns. He had run background checks on Julian's past associates and found a trail of dissolved firms and broken promises. When he presented these red flags, Elias didn't see a warning. He saw a betrayal of the loyalty he so highly prized. Defending Julian with a fierce, irrational intensity, Elias fired his old advisor on the spot. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. By cutting ties with his most honest critic, Elias effectively dismantled the final safety net protecting his life's work. The night of the final signing was a grand affair. At an opulent dinner celebrating the launch of Project Titan, the mood was electric. Surrounded by expensive wine and the city lights, Elias felt a profound sense of accomplishment. With a steady hand and a warm smile, he signed the documents that legally transferred his authority to Julian. He believed he was securing his legacy. In reality, he was handing Julian the executioner's blade. They shook hands, a grip that felt like steel, as Julian's eyes sparkled with a hidden dark triumph. The first crack appeared the very next morning, though it felt more like a seismic shift. Elias arrived at his headquarters, but the glass doors did not recognize his security badge. He tried several times, the light flashing a mocking, mechanical red. Looking through the glass, he saw new security guards, men he didn't recognize standing where his trusted team used to be. The silence of the lobby was deafening. Confused and rising with a sudden dread, he pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling as he prepared to call Julian. But before he could hit the dial button, the device buzzed with an incoming message. It was a single text from his brother, and it cut deeper than any physical wound. The message read, "Thank you for the empire, Elias, but it was never truly yours. It was a debt owed to my father, and today that debt is paid in full." Elias dropped his hand, the phone feeling like lead. He watched through the glass as a maintenance crew began to peel his name off the directory in the lobby. In less than 24 hours, the man who built everything had become a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. The silence in the lobby was quickly replaced by the cold, mechanical reality of a total blackout. Elias sat in his car, his hands trembling as he refreshed his banking app for the 10th time. Invalid credentials. He tried his personal accounts, the ones he had kept separate for decades, only to find they had been swept clean into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. Julian's Project Titan had been a vacuum, designed to suck every cent from Elias's world the moment the ink on those documents dried. It wasn't just the company, it was the deed to his home, the titles to his cars, and even the small endowments for his charitable foundations. Every legal thread of his existence had been pulled, leaving him unraveled and shivering in the driver's seat of a vehicle that technically no longer belonged to him. By noon, the digital world had already begun to feast on his carcass. News of the hostile takeover spread through the financial wires like a virus. The media, once enamored with Elias's rags-to-riches story, pivoted instantly. They painted him not as a victim, but as a reckless gambler who had bet his legacy on a volatile merger and lost. The phones that usually rang incessantly with invitations to galas and board meetings went deathly silent. His friends, the men and women who had toasted his health just a week prior, vanished into the shadows of high society. To them, Elias was no longer a titan. He was a cautionary tale, a social pariah whose proximity was now a liability. The professional respect he had cultivated for 30 years dissolved in less than 6 hours, replaced by a cold, calculating indifference that felt more painful than the financial ruin itself. The walk through his front door felt like a march to a gallows. His wife, a woman who had stood by him since the days of the single truck and the paper maps, met him in the hallway. Her eyes weren't filled with anger, which almost made it worse. They were filled with a hollow, echoing fear. When she told him that the children's college funds, money he thought was untouchable, had been liquidated as part of the consolidation, the breath left his lungs. He had spent 30 years building a fortress to protect his family, only to realize he had personally opened the gates for the barbarian. The realization of his failure as a provider hit Elias harder than the financial loss. He saw the future he had promised his children evaporating in the face of his own blindness, a realization that felt like a physical blow to his chest. But Julian's cruelty had a second act. As Elias frantically contacted his few remaining legal allies, he discovered the hidden knife Julian had twisted into his back. It wasn't enough to steal the empire. Julian had planted a meticulous trail of digital breadcrumbs, suggesting Elias had been embezzling funds for years to cover personal gambling debts. It was a lie, but it was a well-crafted one, supported by forged signatures and redirected wire transfers that Elias had unknowingly authorized during the Titan transition. If Elias tried to fight back in court, Julian would trigger a criminal investigation that would likely end in a prison sentence. He was trapped in a cage made of his own misplaced trust, facing the terrifying reality that his reputation would be permanently incinerated. 3 days later, Elias stood on the sidewalk across from his former headquarters. A freezing rain began to fall, soaking through his coat, but he didn't move. He watched, mesmerized by the cruelty of the spectacle, as a massive crane hoisted a new sign onto the building's facade. His name was gone. In its place, the word Valerius glowed in cold blue neon, the name of Julian's holding company. He was a man with nothing left but the damp clothes on his back, and a burning, incandescent sense of injustice that kept his heart beating when everything else told him to stop. He stood there for hours, a forgotten king watching his kingdom being renamed by a traitor who had never laid a single brick of the foundation. With no home to return to, he found himself at a dusty, forgotten storage unit on the edge of the city, the one asset Julian's lawyers had overlooked because it was listed under his late father's name. Inside, amidst the relics of a simpler life, he found an old encrypted hard drive. It had belonged to Julian's father, a man Elias had helped decades ago when the man's own business was failing. At the time, Elias thought it was an act of charity. As he bypassed the dated security on the drive, using a password his father had once mentioned, a file directory appeared that froze his blood. The drive contained the one secret Julian thought was buried forever, a trove of documents and personal records proving that Julian's entire identity was a lie, a carefully constructed mask designed to hide a truth that could destroy him. Elias didn't let the grief consume him. He let the cold logic of the drive's contents sharpen his focus. Using the last of his untraceable cash, he moved through the city like a ghost, reconnecting with street-level contacts he had ignored in the ivory tower. He soon discovered the scope of Julian's endgame. Julian wasn't interested in running a logistics empire. He was preparing to strip it for parts. He was in the final stages of selling the operation to a predatory conglomerate. If the sale went through, the legacy Elias built would be erased, leaving his former workers on the street without a safety net. He realized that his past generosity was now his greatest weapon. The drive contained enough evidence to blow Julian's world apart. But doing so publicly would trigger a collapse that would take the company down too. Elias faced a difficult choice. He could leak the documents and watch Julian burn, satisfy his revenge, and accept the destruction of his work. Or he could play a much more dangerous game, one that required him to step back into the lion's den without the protection of his wealth. Honor, he realized, wasn't about what he owned, but about who he protected. He decided that Julian would fall, but the empire would belong to the people who built it. The opportunity arrived at a private black-tie gala. Elias didn't sneak in. He walked through the front door with the quiet confidence of a man who had already seen the end of the world. He intercepted Julian in a secluded library away from the champagne. Julian looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance, but the look vanished the moment Elias slid a printed photograph from the drive across the table. It was a picture of Julian's father, looking broken and defeated. He noticed the sweat beading on Julian's forehead as the color drained from the younger man's face, replaced by a primal fear. Elias spoke softly. Julian's father hadn't been a titan. He was a man who once tried to ruin Elias's own father, only to be broken by his own greed. But the real blow came when Elias produced a handwritten letter from Julian's father. In it, the old man expressed deep regret for his vendetta. He confessed that when he was at his lowest, it was Elias who had secretly provided the funds for Julian's education and medical care. Julian's entire life of hatred had been built on a foundation of lies. The man he spent years trying to destroy was the only reason he had a future. Elias didn't ask for his money back. Instead, he presented legal documents prepared by his former CFO. Using the leverage of the drive and the proof that the embezzlement evidence was forged, Elias gave Julian one choice: sign the company over to a worker-owned cooperative or face a life sentence. With his identity exposed and his father's legacy revealed as a debt of gratitude, Julian's resolve shattered. He signed with a trembling hand, stripped of his power, his pride, and his purpose. He didn't even fight. He simply drifted out of the room, a man who realized he had spent his life killing the person who saved him. Weeks later, the blue neon sign was taken down. The company was now governed by its employees, a stable entity that prioritized the livelihoods of thousands. Julian disappeared into obscurity, broken by the truth. Elias moved his family into a modest apartment. He sat in a small office starting over and building a venture based on his integrity. He looked out the window and realized that the collapse had been a necessary demolition. Trust is a gift, but wisdom is the shield that protects it. For the first time in his life, Elias felt truly unbreakable.